Hey guys, so this video we're going to talk about cylinders and their topology. It's going to help some of you beginners out, especially if you're just getting into 3D modeling, but we're going to get into some tools, techniques, and working some really advanced stuff as well. So we're just going to start with vertex counts. Okay, so you can see over here on the left, there's two base cylinders that you're more than likely going to utilize. Anything with less than 6 vertices is not going to technically create a cylinder if you were to subdivide it. So just keep that in mind. 6 is your minimum base here. And as you can see, you have 6 vertices to create a cylinder. It's only symmetrical in one direction, okay? So just keep that in mind. When you subdivide it, it's going to become 12 and then 24 and 48, like so. But a lot of people go with 8 vertex minimum, right? On their base cylinder shape. So this is going to subdivide to 16, 32, and 64. Of course, this is symmetrical in both directions as well. So it's a good thing to know. Now, when you take a cube and you turn it into a quad sphere, usually you subdivide it one time or two, and then you apply a cast modifier, it'll turn into a quad sphere. The center loop here, when you do it with one level of subdivision, you can see it's going to go 4, 8, and then 16, 32, etc. So you can see how that 8 base is actually quite useful. All right. Now we're going to get into the rotation aspect here, but we're going to do this in 3D. So let's hop over to 3D real quick in Blender, and we'll do a new scene. Okay, and so we'll subdivide this one once, and we'll go ahead and add a cast modifier. So that's how you create your quad sphere. Convert it to a mesh, no big deal. So spheres and cylinders are kind of related in a way. There's some things you need to think about when you're using these things. So when we take a look at this UV sphere, you'll see here this is actually a 32 count going around it, right? That's the default settings. Of course, you can change that count to whatever you need it to be. But when you have these numbers in mind when you're working with spheres, these things can quickly and easily turn into cylindrical shapes by deleting the bottom and then extruding the edge down like so. So you can create pill shapes and things like that as well. All right. But when you create your cylinders themselves, here we can see we can type in 6 vertices, and now we can pull that out. We could create a cylinder with 8 vertices, and we can also pull that out. So these are our base shapes basically that we'll be working with. Now, it's not to say you can't create cylinders in other ways. I want to just point something out. If you create a plane, pull it out right here, and let's say we're modeling on this thing a little bit. All right, we want to turn this thing into a cylinder. We can use a simple deform modifier. So if we add some loop cuts in here, this is a little bit tricky. You want to try to match the numbers over here, whether they're going to be 16, 24s, or 32s, or whatever. And in order to do that, let's say we wanted to make a 16 side cylinder, we're going to go one less on the number of cuts here. Okay. And the reason is when this gets wrapped around on itself, these two end vertices will merge. And so if we look at the vertex count now, it's at 17. So when they merge, it'll be a 16 side cylinder. Keep that in mind. Now we're going to add a simple deform modifier. I'm going to change this to bend. Okay, and you'll see it's not really doing exactly what we want yet. It's kind of just doing whatever it wants. And so what we're going to just put the 3D cursor right at the center on that origin point. So we're going to select it, Shift S, cursor to selected. Okay, and now we'll have that there. We can press Shift A, create empty plane axis. Go back to our mesh here, not the empty. And what you'll see is we can actually select it off the list here, or we can go ahead and use the eyedropper and select empty like so. All right, and it's still not going to behave exactly the way you want. We do actually have to take this thing and rotate it. So I'm going to just switch this to arrows real quick so we have a better idea of what we can see is going on here with the empty. But basically, we're going to take R, Y, and hit 9, 0. This thing could be a little bit finicky to set up sometimes using the empty like this. So you'll have to fool around with these settings and the idea of rotating the empty at 90 degrees. It might be on the Y-axis, X-axis, or even Z-axis sometimes. It depends on your object's local rotation as well. But then you're gonna also have to come over here to the modifier and maybe change it to one of these different settings. In this case, I'm gonna use Y, and we can wrap this all the way up now. Don't forget to check bend. It's not twist, bend, okay? And so once we've done that, you can see we could turn this shape into a cylinder. Now, the problem with this, if I shade it auto smooth and turn my wireframes off, you'll see it all merges just fine. I mean, it's all solid geometry except here at the bottom. Okay, and so this is a little bit of an issue. So we might want to use a weld modifier after the fact. Okay, so weld, and it should get rid of that. Now we can add a subdivision with Control 2, and so we have a subdivision cylinder like so. Now what's fun about this, you can go back into edit mode. It looks a little bit weird. Turn it off in edit mode. And what we can do is we can go through this and we can add loop cuts as long as these ends here are completely flat, right? So like this one isn't doing this number, okay? If they're completely flat on both sides, it should wrap up into a cylinder just fine. The moment you have some deviations between the edges like this, you'll get little gaps in it and things like that. So just keep that in mind. Also, this vertex and this vertex, they need to align on Z and they need to align on Y. Sometimes you'll lose this value. I just want to point this out. And you could try doing shift X in this case, S and shift X to scale. And you can hit 0 and that will average between the two of them. Okay, so you can do that and align them, but sometimes you want, like, say, this vertex to go to this vertex position, right? So the way you do this is you use an active element. Okay, an active element up here. Once you set that, if you shift double click anything, you'll see it highlights usually, and that's going to be your active element. Okay, so we can make this the active element. We can hit S and shift X and hit 0, and that'll line those two up now. So that's a good thing to know when you're working with this, so that way you can get them to meet up with each other and you don't have weird gaps and things not welding together here at the bottom. Okay, so but we can work with this cylinder now, and we can start making different little features on it if we wanted to. So if we do an inset, hold control while insetting, you can do this number. You can see we could get that going very quickly, like so. All right, now here's a little problem with this. Let's say it's too curved. We want this to be a sharper corner, right? And to make this a sharper corner, you would think you could just add loop cuts like you normally would, and you would pile them in there. The problem is it makes this little section faceted. And also, let's say we just increase resolution in one area, you'll also see that it causes problems over here on this side as well. So it does facet it out. It does kind of look funny like that. Now, the reason that occurs is because the resolutions here on cylinders are extremely important. If you need an additional edge to tighten these little sections up here, it's going to become imbalanced. And basically, when it subdivides, it's going to create weird, odd cylindrical type shapes, but they're not really cylinders anymore. You have to increase the resolution a lot of times over the whole model in order for the rest of it to smooth at the same rates with the Catmull-Clark algorithm when you subdivide. Okay, and you might need to add some loop cuts through here. These ones are a little bit more forgiving going across in this direction, but the vertical ones definitely are going to cause you a lot of problems, possibly. And so a lot of times you need to avoid using what's called N poles and E poles. So here's an E pole. This is a vertex with 5 edges or more coming out of it. And so when you do use these things, you need to be very careful about where you're placing them because they can mess things up very quickly, potentially. And the same is true for N poles. And N poles are going to be a vertex with 3 edges coming out of it. Okay, so you gotta be careful with these things. You will utilize them, they will show up across your model. However, you need to be very careful with them and try to avoid using them if possible. So don't think that you can just get away with having a random E-pole in some random location on a cylindrical surface, because what it does is a lot of times E-poles and N-poles redirect topology in different ways. Okay, so you can see this one happens to just shoot this over in that direction, and so this little number here is occurring with that E-pole. And so when you start doing that on a cylindrical or curved surface in general, a lot of times that can cause weird shading issues and whatnot. But you can see I am starting to tighten this thing up a little bit, and we can work on this until we're happy with our results here. We could do things like select this whole area with Control Shift click and select loops, boundary loops. Now we can do a bevel in here, mouse wheel up once, change the shape to a 1 so we get what's called a Korean bevel. Basically, it is when you bevel with a shape of 1, you can see what's going on there. It doesn't add any curvature necessarily. Okay, and so we can grab those. It's just adding the holding edges there or our sidewalks if you want to look at them like that. Okay, so that's just something you can keep in mind as well as you're working with these things. Now, if you start deviating the edges around like this, you'll see that oftentimes it causes a little flat spot. So you don't want to do that either. Cylinders can be very picky when it comes to topology. And this is why a lot of times you're going to just have really bad looking cylinders or weird shading going on them. It's a lot of things that can go into this, right? Now let's talk about loop tools real quick. So loop tools is interesting. We'll do it on a actual cylinder. So I'm going to take this shape now. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate it and right click. That's now we have 2 in the same spot basically. So we can convert this to a mesh real quick. Turn the subdivision off first and convert it to a mesh. And we'll pull it out to the side here. So we have a collapsed version of that. Now, loop tools can be kind of interesting. If we take a little patch like this, usually you want to have even amount of vertices on each side. Okay. And so we can grab that whole section again. Do that. We can use the loop tools add-on. This comes with Blender. Just enable it, and we can go ahead and do a circle here. Now the circle by default flattens, right? That's a lot of times you won't want that to occur because you can see it's going to cause a little bit of an issue perhaps. So you can turn flatten off. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So you'll have to toggle that on and off and kind of get used to working with it potentially. I'm going to show you another way that works better than flatten in my opinion, and you'll find this one quite interesting when we get to it. So we could try to do an inset. The problem with inset is you can see the edges kind of go in at weird angles. So if you do that, I have edge rail on. You might want to turn edge rail off, and it won't do that. Okay, I have it on by default. You should have it off by default, so you might not see that issue. But when you do that, there you go. You can extrude that in potentially. You see how it extrudes in, like so. It's going off of the normal. Okay, and that normal is not really going towards the center. I think it's just slightly off. We'll hide the quad sphere real quick. It should be slightly off, I think, in this case. Right. So this brings up another point here. If you were to take, say, these edges, let's say these faces, and we extrude them out, they go along the normal. Okay. A lot of times you want to work towards the center of your object. In our case, our origin point's way up here, and it's not at the center. So we could position the origin point in the center, and one of the easiest ways to do that is like two vertices that are perfectly in line with each other. And you could place with machine tools, or you could just do, uh, put 3D cursor to select it, or and then do let's see. So you put the cursor there, and then you set the object's origin to the 3D course, 3D cursor, right? The old school regular Blender way, easier with machine tools. You just Shift S and you hold Alt so you don't adopt rotational values, and you send it to there. Okay. So that's a possibility you could do. But you can also do that with the 3D cursor as well. And so when you place a 3D cursor somewhere like this, and we can see when we extrude, it's going off in whatever direction it wants. But we could also utilize the 3D cursor as the origin or the pivot point. So when we extrude and we right click and press S now, we can scale from that 3D cursor. You can see what that's doing. Okay, so that's something that you could utilize. If we scaled inwards, you'll see it goes towards it, right? Okay, so maybe you want to do that, maybe you don't. Now, the problem is that 3D cursors sometimes might be forward or backwards. You can actually adjust it over here. Um, there's a little spot for it. We can kind of move it around in this way as well. You can actually hold control and snap if you have absolute grid snap on. You can snap it to the grid, by the way. You can actually shift right click, and as you're shift right clicking, you can drag it around. You can also hold control and snap it to the grid as well. You can use snapping with the 3D cursor if you didn't know that. Anyways, whatever the case, let's go ahead and once you can't like undo it back into position though. It's a little bit unfortunate. But let's just go ahead and place this thing again real quick, like so. And we're going to push that 3D cursor back on Y. Just want to point out something here real quick. I'm going to press A and merge so I can get these back. If I was to press E and right click and scale, you'll see it scales towards it like that as well. So if you don't want to do that, what you do is you press S and Shift Y or Shift X or whatever you need. And you can scale towards the center, regardless of where that 3D cursor is, as far as it's in the Y direction here. So you can always work with it in that manner. So if you ever wanted to scale out, hit Shift Y. We can do this number like that. So this is extremely important because you're going to find this to be very useful when modeling on certain things when you can't go across like symmetry. Because if we were using the default settings with medium point, right, and we had say selected two things that are perfectly in line with each other and press E and S, you'll see they scale towards their medium point, which is at the center between them, which is nice. But when we're doing asymmetrical things, perhaps and we try doing that number, we press E and S, you'll see they go to that point. That's the medium point between them, right? So we might need that 3D cursor. So when we switch back to it and we try scaling in now, you can see we get a much different result out of that, right? So that's nice. That's a good one to know anyways. You'll definitely utilize it at some point or another. All right, so degree increments. Let's talk about this. This is a pretty important one in my opinion. So it doesn't look like much when you first look at it. You're like, okay, 90 degrees, 45 degrees, pretty standard stuff. But what's this 22.5? And there's another one in here that we don't have, which is 11.25. Okay, that'd be like that. So what we're looking at is halves. So this is half here. 90 to 45 is a half. 45, divide it in half. You get 22.5, and then 11.25 is half of 22.5. All right, this seems pretty standard to understand. So when you're working with a mesh, let's just create a cube. I'm going to prove a point here. If we had a cube and we took a edge and we bevel it, and while we're beveling, we hit C to clamp it so it goes all the way out, and then we mouse wheel up, we can do a number like this. Now I'm using that shape of 1, so I'm going to change it back to 0.5, okay? And then AM merged by distance. So we just bevel that whole edge like that. So what we're going to do is bevel. Let's do it again. We're going to hit B, Control B to bevel, and we're going to hit C to clamp it, and then just mouse wheel up to what you need. Make sure it's at 0.5, or you can use another number if you needed. AM merged by distance, because we have doubles in the corners when we do that. So if this had a pivot point right here, okay, this is really easy to understand now. When we rotate this thing, if we duplicate it, we hit Shift D, R, and hold Control. We will rotate. You can see in this one 90 degrees, right? Every 90 degrees, and we can make a cylinder out of it. Okay, so pretty standard stuff there, I think. But what happens when you have a big cylinder shape and it's 32 sided, or you have a cylinder and it's 32 sided at least, and I'm going to hit Alt Z and I'm going to cut it. We can cut it the same, perhaps, right? I'm gonna not cut that side for a second. We could cut it the same so we could do our 90-degree rotations, but if we had cut it in half, we'll get 45-degree rotations. And if we were to cut it all the way down to this point here, where we have this little segment, just like this, we could do a single face if we wanted as well, but we're gonna do the little segment like this where it's centered. And we rotate this out. It doesn't really matter where you rotate it because it's not ever gonna line up if you snap it into place. You have to use that number there, negative 22.5 in this case. Oh, you can see that went crazy. I don't know why I did that, but let's try that again. 50R, pull it out, and we're gonna do our negative 22.5, okay? And so those will line up now perfectly. Okay, so we can hit Shift R. Oh, I don't know why it's doing that. We got the 3D cursor on or something. What's going on here? So we're gonna go to back to medium point. We'll try it again. Shift D R, okay, negative 22.5. Blender sometimes has weird quirks to it. I'm not sure exactly what that one's doing or why, but that should not be occurring. Very odd. Let's go to our item real quick and check it. Sometimes it's bad scale, bad rotation. Um, in this case, I'm really not sure why Blender decided to do that. Shift D, R, Z, hold Control, snap it out. We put it to, oh, now it's saying 22.5, and then Shift R. I found that sometimes Blender, okay, it's working now. I found that sometimes Blender will start to act or behave irrationally before it crashes. So if you ever see something weird like that happening, that could be a possibility. It could be something you're doing. But anyways, back to the point, 22.5 degrees, you can see we could turn all these little segments into their own little piece basically. And it goes all the way around the whole shape. So let's make this the active element here. And now I'm going to hit Control L and we're going to link object data. Okay. And so when we link object data, they all share the same mesh now. So if I do an inset here, it'll do an inset on all of it. Right. So this is another way you can work with cylinders as well. There's nothing wrong with this. This is actually how you're going to end up doing. You could potentially at least do modular kit pieces in this manner, where you can have you can swap out different little parts basically to the cylindrical shape. So you can have maybe this here, and then have a couple different ones here, and then have that same one repeat. And you can make your whole poster columns or walls or whatever. You can do this in this manner. Okay. But other than that, cylinders are really quite simple to work with. Um, we'll talk about using, well, I'll talk about modular kits later on with how you can deform whole walls into the shapes of cylinders and stuff. I made one already kind of talking about that, but whatever the case, cylinders are really easy to work with. Other than that, like you have to think about balance. Remember, we had to add a edge loop for everything on there. We want to pay particular attention to our E poles and N poles. A lot of times, these corners they need to do this number instead, as opposed to go into another little segment way out here. Although you will do that occasionally, at times you might have to. They really like to split instead, and so our E poles kind of maintained in this little area here now instead of being like all the way out here in weird areas perhaps. That's more useful on when you're in big sections like this. You see it's kind of maintained in here. So as long as you're keeping those things in mind as you're working, try to use quads, try to keep them nice and neat. You're not going to always be able to do that, unfortunately. You will find times where you absolutely need an E-pole or an end pole on or near an edge. Uh, it's just something that's going to happen, and it's unfortunate, but it's true. So you do have to be careful as you're modeling, and just check and pay particular attention to those E-poles, end poles. Check for stretching. Make sure everything's got edge flows going in the direction you expect them to go. So do make sure your edge flows are kind of behaving well here. They're not doing anything super irrational, generally speaking, and they're only following the shapes of your geometry to the best of their ability. So there is a lot of challenge in that, right? Now, so there's any number of issues you might encounter along the way when working with a cylindrical shape. When you're doing things like nuts or bolts, for example. I think I got a six side here. Yeah. Okay. Sometimes you still have to do things like maybe you select all these edges and you're going to have to maybe do like a bevel here. Keep in mind when you're doing this kind of stuff, you can further optimize this later on, perhaps. If you're careful, you'll see that we can pull that back out. Sometimes you still have to do collapses, or it's useful to do collapse or reductions, should I say? I call them collapse, but whatever. Reductions. So you merge these at center all the way through the shape. So you can still do these things on flat surfaces, and that's quite useful, right? So when you subdivide, I'm going to get rid of the bottom so it doesn't subdivide. All right. So you'll still find that you need to sometimes do reductions and whatnot on your models at certain points, and on flat surfaces, it just works out better, generally speaking. I can see, even though this isn't technically a cylinder, but it was made from a six-sided cylinder. So I think you get the idea here. This is how you can start doing like screw threads and things like that. You can see sometimes you just run into little weird issues. Like if we had done all that on the corner there and we try to raise the middle here, as this subdivides down, let's bring that back up. As it subdivides down, we get this kind of effect here. So if that's, something you're looking for, maybe that's something you could do. And you want to try to keep your model simple as much as possible. But because of the nature of cylinders, a lot of times they're going to go and get pretty dense rather quickly. There's really nothing you can do about that in some sense. Um, you might be able to find like be able to do reductions and maybe minimize that, but a lot of times you just need the density to the cylinder, and especially when you're trying to do details. Like if I'm trying to push this section in here and create a little detail here, and we subdivide that, we don't have the resolution here for that, right? So we'd have to add some loop cuts, and then we need two loop cuts in here. But now this is all destroyed. It's not able to wrap back up on itself, so we end up with this nice little flat spot here, and we'll have to do that to every little segment potentially, right? So now you're going to start seeing why it's important that you also uh, you approach these things in a methodical manner as you're working on them. So a lot of times using the wrap method is extremely useful. You can correct the curvature by eye a little bit. I don't want to get into this too much because it's not technically the right way of doing things. But like if you had a cylinder here, for example, you create a circle on it as well. So I'm gonna rotate that circle. We can use this as a guide. So if we control 5 to subdivide that, it's just a circle. I mean, there's nothing special about that, right? It's a string of vertices, basically. And we can use that as a guide sometimes to work out edges. So we hit Alt Z, we can find that circle in here somewhere, wherever it went. If I can get a hold of it, there you go. And just trying to figure out which edge it was here. Okay. And so we can use that as a guide a lot of times. And so this is where you would also utilize 3D cursor, possibly. You want to make sure you hit S and shift whatever you got to hit. So S and shift Y in this case, maybe. And you could push these things out to your guide. And so this is just an easy way to kind of eyeball fixing little topology issues. But because this is not um, this is not done on every edge, it wouldn't be that efficient right now. We'd actually have to go back and do this every single. You can see where that's going to add up. That's going to eat time. Eat a lot of It's going to take up a lot of time and just kind of eat up the project. It's going to slow you down a little too much sometimes. But if you have to recover a shape, that's a possibility, right? It is a possibility that you can do that. And you can see I'm pushing all of them out. And in this area here, I didn't really need to push this area out. And so as a result of that, we start getting some weird topology in here. All right. So just keep that in mind. But because this is what it is, we can use loop tools. We can flatten it perhaps later. We'll just push it in for now and then flatten it. And we'll see what happens there. And we'll shade it smooth, subdivide it. Okay. The middle section we'll press. Let's try this again. I think I had 3D cursor as the position there. So let's just press E, S, E, S, 2 loop cuts in here. Boom. Okay. And so we may flatten this out in here as well. Loop tools, flatten. It's up to you what your model needs, but you can see we kind of recovered it a little bit. It's a little bit off still with some weird stuff going on. That's just that density change in the loops here. Okay, so sometimes this happens as well, where you have, we added those loops going through here. We'll have to have loops going through all of it as well. So yeah, you can see where that gets a little finicky, that kind of technique and working with it in that manner. But we can use a set flow add-on. So set flow is free. You can just download it, install it, and you can set flow on some things like this sometimes, and it works out quite well, generally speaking. It doesn't always get things right though, so you got to use it with caution. But you can see we can set flow in these areas. So we're starting to fix that curvature there. If we had added the additional edge cuts everywhere, we probably could work that whole shape back out to be somewhat correct. I'm not going to say it'll turn out super correct, but it probably could turn out very close to correct. It doesn't get things perfect, at least not set flow. And there are some options for it that you can tweak down here. So iteration counts and tension can be quite useful as well. All right. And so you can see this side is starting to look proper. This side is a little bit messed up still. So you can think of this as like the after or before, and this is the after over here. So yeah, little finesse tweaking things. Now let's talk about the one thing I didn't show yet, which is it's going to be part of the Machine Tools add-on. This is called Surface Slide. Machine Tools, if you don't have it, it's free. There's a paid version for it as well, which adds a couple of additional features which are quite useful, including Punch It. If you've seen the Punch It add-on, it's part of Machine Tools Deus Ex version, which is the paid version of Machine Tools. But there's a feature that you'll probably want to turn on. Oops, I'm on the wrong one here. You want to go to Machine Tools. You want to turn on Surface Slide, okay? And you're going to want to turn on the modes pie. Generally speaking, if you want to access Surface Slide, and so when you take your mesh and you hit tab now, you get the modes pie. You can go to object mode, you can go to edit mode, you can do straight into edit mode to face selection, edge selection, or vertex selection. Okay. But when you're in edit mode of any type, using any of those, right? You can turn on surface slide. You'll see when we turn it on, surface slide is on. If we turn it off, we hit tab key, we can turn it off. Okay, so let's turn it on. And if we do something like take this section here and we inset it, we loop tools and we circle it, you can see what happens here. What it's doing is it's adding a temporary shrink wrap modifier. So we can't actually distort this mesh. We can move this around. Well, it will distort it slightly, but a lot of times it's very minimal. And so we can move this around on this surface, no problem. You don't want to use this in areas like this because even though you could, it's kind of problematic. You see what I'm saying? So you want to try to keep it on flat surfaces for the most part, or at least curved surfaces. And we can shift this around quite a bit and do what we need with it. Then we can turn surface slide off. We can do maybe like an inset, and then we can extrude it down, we can inset again. And you can see where that's going right there, right? So we can do that all day long, no problems. And if we need to tweak anything, like we can turn surface slide back on, and we can just move things around as needed a little bit. Okay, now it will affect your geometry overall, but you can tweak these edges just slightly and get away with it, especially if your resolution is high enough on your model where you can shift them around. You're not going to have too many problems with that. And so if we were to go back and look at it, it might be slightly off. It might have a little bit of flattening effect taking place or just weird kind of curvature lines going through it. But for the most part, you see we moved that quite a bit. Not a big issue, right? So I think I'm going to end this video here. There's a lot that goes into modeling with cylinders, but that's just kind of like a crash course on the main things you might be looking at using the thing. I think those are the big takeaways from this video, anyways, right? Um, just keep them in mind as you're working, and you'll start to see how they all play together as you do more and more modeling, at least. So, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll check you out in the next one. All right, take care.